Hi, Misha here, and last time we looked at a couple of Sega hunters or sporters, or as a couple of people were very happy to point out, they didn't like my pronunciation, so yes, Sega, if you prefer. Either way, we know what we mean, and does it really matter? I agree, sometimes it does, but anyway, talking about how this was the true Yamash import, formerly ISHS machine, and it's based on the AK-100 series, AK-103, AK-74M, AK-101, depending on the caliber. So if you wanted that, you could either get one of these and convert it and have a pretty authentic Russian, or you could get an SGL 2131. But what if you wanted something earlier, like the AKM? Well, the truth is, there are just too many changes and differences. So your only options are builds using original parts kits, sans receiver or barrel, like mine that you've seen on the channel. Did this about 9 years ago with Legion USA, using what was actually a Molot refurbished, and over in Russia, semi-auto rework of an AKM. But of course, when they came over here, the barrel and receiver had to be cut up and other things. And of course, over in Russia too, there are some deactivated guns. So you can use essentially the bolt group, top cover, trunnion, furniture, barrel hardware, safety. Okay, it's fine. So what we did back then was using one of the FB Radom barrels. They're properly 16 1/4 inches, called Emerald Forge chrome lined. Perfect. And almost as good, we have one of the Childers Gullers receivers, which, while they're imported here, they are made originally on Polish tooling. So you get things like proper mag weld dimples, you get the weld spots over here, matches up quite nicely, and they even do correct, more or less, markings. As you can see here, even has a fake third notch. So that was about as good as we could do. At least the barrel and receiver are correct. And these did well, but Legion hasn't done these in a long time. Must have been a good concept, because Atlantic followed suit some years later using Tula parts kits, but also Childers receivers and FB Radom barrels. Well, today, as you already know based on the title, there's another play of the game, and almost all the time in comment sections when people aren't correcting my pronunciation, they ask about this Palmetto State, this PSA or that PSA. Well, we got lucky today. One of them walked in the door. So, let's open up the box and check out the PSA Soviet Arms, as they label it. Tula, well, I think they call it an AK-47, although AKM would be more correct. And just for the YouTubes, this is not a T&E gun. This was actually one that I purchased. So, yeah, opinions are my own. No paid sponsorship. But if you'd like to help support us, check out the link to Patreon. And if you can't do that, I get it. Liking, sharing, and subscribing, and also checking out kind of a backlog of videos helps all the time. With that, let's dive in. Looking at the accessories as they are quickly, we have a waffle mag, cable lock, hang tag, manual, rubber boot, and foam and a cardboard box. That's fine. I don't expect a gun like this to be all fancy, even though I think PSA tried marketing them as bougie guns. Let's see which one we got. And here it is. But I had to put a more correct magazine in it. Hey, I got a cleaning rod. But you'll notice there's not a sling on it. So, could this be a PSA actually worthy of getting a sling in my collection? Well, I have thoughts. Some good things, some bad, and my opinion very well could change throughout the video because this really did just come in. What we have here, at least per trunnion date, is 1963 Tula. And PSA guarantees, they say, a matching trunnion, bolt carrier, top cover, gas tube, and recoil assembly. So, we'll compare and contrast this to my old Legion USA build. And while we're at it, we'll talk about the differences because these are actually two worth comparing. Because mine is actually a 1973 Mishaco. So, the two different makers, separated by a decade, and they pretty much illustrate all the changes in the AKM production line within Russia. The AKM was in production from 1959 through 1977, at least officially, but it's still in service today, especially the AKMS, and older guns are refurbished and repaired. So, where to begin? First, I'm going to go ahead and take these mags out just to make it easier on myself moving around. I will say that these phenolic resin AG4 Bakelite mags were first introduced in 1968, so they actually do predate the AK-74. But when the AKM was introduced, the rather famous ribbed mag was the thing, although there were the lightweight alloy waffle mags that were trialed out, but never were successful. So, appropriate for an early and appropriate for a late, but of course they're interchangeable. Of course, the original AK Type 1 on a stamped receiver, although a very different pattern, first went into production in 1949. And the milled would follow in 1951, and the Type 3 we all know and love would appear in 1953. And it would be the first to make the chrome line bore a standard feature. And by 1956, the Red Army was fielding these in ever larger numbers and kind of figuring out what they were good at. Good. By this time, though, they were looking for the replacement. They had not given up on the stamped receiver concept. It just needed time to mature. And they also wanted something that was just faster, easier to produce, that didn't consume as much steel, was lighter, and more controllable and automatic, and more accurate. And in 1955, the earliest specifications were laid out, and you had trials going on from 56 through 58. And Tula would actually submit their own design. The Kovarov Arsenal would submit one as well. And Mishaco Machine Plant would submit their own design, which was still spearheaded by Mikhail Kalashnikov himself. And yes, of course, it would win, mostly because it was so common and already well known, and it was good enough. It went from being roughly 9 pounds to 7 pounds. The stamped receiver was lighter. Everything was made easier to use. And they went to a new single hook trigger with the so-called rate reducer, the out-of-battery safety, to keep the RPM reasonable. They made some changes to the furniture, like the palm swells on the handguards. Those were done to give better grip and automatic fire to kind of compensate for the lighter barrel. Ironically, the famous slant muzzle brake, sugar scoop, did not immediately appear. In the beginning, while they still had 14mm threaded muzzles, they had muzzle nuts. So, technically, for a 63, this should have a muzzle nut, But in service, most older guns would get a break. And also keep in mind, even if PSA did their absolute best and kept the kits together as well as they could, these guns were used, rebuilt, recycled, had parts replaced. So it is very difficult to get 100% correct, all parts original to the year kit. So I want to give credit there. It really is. And, of course, manufacturing would begin low rate at Mishaco in 1959. And by 1960-61, they were ramping things up. Tula, on the other hand, they did not ever make the original AK, Type 1, 2, or 3. Instead, in the 50s, they focused on the SKS, not to mention other guns. But 60, they started tooling up, and by 1961, maybe late 1960, they too started somewhat low-rate production, but they were a very experienced factory, and they too would begin tooling up and cranking them out. By this year, 1963, numbers are going up, and away. And so, by the mid-60s, you've got two manufacturers in Russia turning out the new Type 4 receiver AKM. Now, I want to give a disclaimer, a reminder, before we get into the parts transition. Now, sometimes I've been lucky and been able to handle things in person, so I can speak to that. But keep in mind, too, sometimes I handled parts years, even decades ago. So my memory's not perfect. And also remember, you can hop online and look at pictures on a forum. Unfortunately, a lot of people do ask me about this marking and that. But guys, I really can't do much in the way of markings because I've literally never seen one. So on those things, I do my best, but I will get some things wrong because just based on reading like photo captions and the text, some things aren't said that are in the pictures. So, with that out of the way, some of the changes early on. It's possible the very first AKMs came with wood pistol grips, but soon they would go to a synthetic grip. Now, you guys can tell me, I know that kind of the marbled or patterned design is correct for a Tula of this era. Is this correct or not? Let me know. One thing I can say is correct is this bolt carrier. Notice it's smooth like an original AK. This one here, you see a step in the carrier, a lightning cut. This would appear around 1963, maybe 62. It is 63 at Tula, somewhere around that time. But when this was made, having a non-lightning cut bolt carrier would have still been fine. I think that's kind of neat. Similarly, the earliest front sight bases did not have lightning cuts. And when I first picked this up, I wasn't sure if this was correct or not on the front sight base, but I think it is. It doesn't appear to be a cast one. Around 63, they started adding lightning cuts to the FSB. They also changed the way the spot right here behind the bayonet lug was machined. This area right in there. That little spot right there. They would slim that up too. At this time, everything is still machined. No cast parts to speak of. There was one more change internally that we'll get to, but I wanted to kind of cover the outside first before we start taking them apart. Seemed a little easier. Now, the metal for the AKM from the get-go had kind of a zinc phosphate undercoat with a kind of matte black, non-reflective overcoat paint. Sometimes this paint was very nicely applied. Sometimes it was a little glooped on, especially during factory refurbishment. So, neither of these are completely original there, of course. But the wood, from the beginning they used laminated Arctic birch, and they gave it a lacquer coat. Now, the Russian red is rather famous, and the AKM would definitely have it. But there would be different hues, and Tula stocks, depending on which year, are known for more of a blood red, whereas Ishesks tend to be a little lighter. In fact, some of the later stock sets even come across as more of a reddish, yellowish, kind of blonde honey color, says the blind guy. Yeah. Moving on. Around 1965 at Ishesk, maybe a year or two later at Tula, the earliest slant brakes would appear, the kind of slab-sided style. They would use those for a year or two, and then by 1968 they would go to the style we know and love. There are tons of little variations in these slant brakes. Now, I've seen people on forums ask, well, if they only use muzzle nuts on the AK and the early AKMs, why thread the barrel? Well, they always had blank fire adapters, and Russia had plans to make other attachments, grenade launchers, even silencers, even those bendy things that shoot around walls like the Germans tried out in World War II. And some of them they even had prototypes of, but as it turns out for the original AK, they just didn't get around to it. But since the AKM was so much lighter, they wanted this offset brake to kind of be a cheap, lightweight way to check recoil, again, especially in automatic fire. YouTube, again, just to mention it, these are some automatic onlys, even if they have selector markings done to just kind of mirror an original. Around 1965, Izhevsk was up and running, sailing smooth with AKM production, and you wouldn't see many changes until the end of the decade. Tula was right alongside them. Early Tulas looked very, very similar to early Izhevsk. The wood was cut ever so slightly different, the stock. And it seems like Tula's always had a little more round handguards, a little softer. Now, this is a late one, so it's very pronounced, but even from the beginning, you kind of see that with Tula. Also, the Tula rear sight was a little different made. One thing kind of neat about this, you do see the large lightning cut. Izhevsks in the 60s would also have lightning cuts, but a different style. And later ones like this would get rid of it entirely because production. But aside from a few other kind of manufacturing things, that was really it. They were very similar at this time. So now let's examine the two receivers on our semi-autos today. And this is something you'll have more to say than me. I know that the coloration on the Legion isn't what a lot of people wanted. You could always repaint it, but I will say the texture it feels right. Whereas the Palmetto State, the top cover, the original part, has the correct texture, of course, but this receiver is much glossier. And here are the markings on the Childers receiver, hopefully anyway. And here on the PSA. Again, hopefully at least. You can decide what you like better. I really wish I could show you the selectors, though. But YouTube doesn't want selectors being moved. I'll just say this is a much stiffer selector that tends to lock in very securely. This one moves rather easily, and you can kind of over travel and hit the stop. Now, is that correctable? Yes, that's easy to do. Bend your lever in. But it is something worth pointing out. Next, let's flip them over and talk magwells. Beginning with the Childers receiver, notice the relatively large dimple, and notice the two prominent weld spots over it. Originally, there were actually 3 weld spots there, but around 1963, they reduced it to just 2. So that's correct for this gun. Looking at the PSA, are there weld spots here? It is very flush. There's a little bit of waviness to the receiver in this area, but again, it's very polished up. I will give it credit, it does have XY stamps. So does this. So that's good. But no really round welds. And the dimple is smaller. Now, I think this is totally by accident, but in reality, one of the differences between a Tula receiver and an Mishaco, at least later on, Tulas did tend to have smaller magwell dimples. Not quite this size, but I think it was an accidental piece of good luck because it is a good approximation to a Tula magwell dimple. And this is good for an Mishaco. But to me, there's something still a little off about the feel of this receiver. And it's actually pretty hard to put my finger on it. But I think charging them might be useful. I wish I was in front of the camera. This would be a lot easier, but I'm not, so we'll do our best. You can't feel it with me, but if you need to, close your eyes and listen. And let's begin with the Legion build on a Children's receiver. That rattling is things on my desk, don't worry. Notice it's very smooth. Got it. Now let's compare to the PSA. All right, beginning here. Do you hear that? The thunk. There we go. Hear that on the top cover versus the Legion. This is something I notice on a lot of palmetto states. The top cover actually has quite a noticeable gap on the sides. See? And the action, while it is smooth, it's so difficult to explain. It just feels different. Not bad. And it doesn't hang up. And I haven't noticed it jumping the rails. I know that's some PSAs early on did that. No, it's not going to jump the rails. I think because it is a proper bolt carrier and all that. So that's good. But there's something about the way the top cover attaches that I think it is the receiver itself. Because I've had other palmetto states, different makes, not just these, but others that just have that kind of can design. And I really wish I could show you this selector. This is so much looser than the other one. And this is a unfired gun. My other one has been fired, not a whole lot, but maybe 500 rounds over the years just for funsies. With that, let's talk triggers. The Legion has the Molot semi-automatic trigger group that they installed. Now, this is the trigger group they use in their Vipers, but when they did the semi-automatic AKMs over there, they put these semi-automatic only single hooks in. It's fine. It's fine. Not 100% correct looking, but it looks okay for a late AKM. But Palmetto State has an ALG. Now, it is at least the curved ALG. I'll give them credit there, not the straight. That would look hideous. And it's a pretty good feeling trigger, but it doesn't look right. Again, being extremely nitpicky, but for what these go for, around $2K, these are a very niche market. I both love and hate that they did try to put a better trigger in, but could you not have found one that looked closer to correct? I mean, with this pistol grip, this stock set, so many other original parts, that trigger, it just stands out like a sore thumb. And I'm blind, and it still stands out to me. What do you think? I don't want to be negative, and I will give credit. Even though this top cover has that hollow thong, it is not loose. And the gas tube is not loose. Some other PSAs I've had in the past were a little rattling. The handguard is not loose. This does feel well put together. Same here from what Legion gave us. And the rivets, a little bit of, flat on the top. That might bug some people. It does not bother me. I am not a rivet snob. That one's good. That one's good. The front rivets look really nice. Not noticing any major gappage. The rears, like I said, have a little bit of doming on this side. But I can't get my fingernail underneath them, so yeah. Let's look at the other side. Yeah, fine on this side too. That one's a little lipped down here. Not enough where I can get my finger on it, but it's a little bit crooked. But again, these could be that way out of the factory in Russia. These were not precision-made guns. They were put together with about the same care and love as a rake, a shovel, a hoe. Because they were just a tool. The Legion guns were cool back in the day because they were actually assembled here, not only using Russian parts, but actually most of their gunsmiths back in the day had once worked at Izhmash or Molat. So, that was nice. Alright, so we've gone over the receiver enough, I think. Let's talk barrels. The FB Radom barrel is correctly made. Perhaps slightly oversized, but not enough that matters, just, on the larger end of spec. Correct steps. No markings to speak of. Nicely threaded. And the PSA does have a cold hammer forged barrel made by FN. How do I know? Because of this. Again, I'm blind, even I can feel this huge marking right on the top there across the entire thing. Come on, guys. Could you not put it under the handguard? Or at least on the underside where it would be partially covered by the cleaning rod. It would have fit right under here. That's like an ugly import mark, I'm not going to lie. And we have this kind of odd step on the barrel here behind the gas block. We have one in front too, like it should be. Like there. But notice this is just straight. This actually flares up just a bit here. That's odd. So, good quality barrel, but the cosmetics could be a lot better. A giant marking, and it is kind of a weird, very obvious step to it. What do you think, though? Pins seem fine. No problems there. Yeah, so I'm still going to give it to the FB Radom barrel, but I do think both are quality barrels when it comes to shooting. As far as, like, accuracy, both are actually well respected. The FN barrels that Palmetto State uses are known for good accuracy, but on the other hand, FB Radom barrels, Polish barrels, have always been respected for their quality too. So, with that, we kind of left off around 1969, 1970 with the parts changes. Let's pick up there again. In the late 60s, Mishaco was looking to increase production and adopt new tooling methods, and also just make some changes based on feedback. So around 1970, the earliest cast parts appear, and these tend to be very small things. One that jumps out as an early is the front handguard retainer. They went to the cast unit here, doubles as a sling swivel. They're pretty easy to tell because this, well, it just looks cast, and it's just more rounded versus sharp-edged. Oh, by the way, I was talking about the barrel having this step here. I know what it is now. The handguard retainer here, notice it's straight in. On all my other AKs, the barrel stays slim, and then it steps up right here before the handguard. So that's why that is. So the spec's the same with the retainer. It's just a little fatter here. Just thought I'd point that out. And, some other early kind of cast parts, like the shaft for the safety that runs through here, went from machined to a cast part. And you'll also see a switch over later on from a just traditional machined paddle mag release to a stamped one. And that is one area where it looks like the PSA, it's hard to say. This does have the hump, which I always identify as a later safety, but this is one of those things you can correct me. I'm not really sure. It's at least not an AK-74 with the big dimple style. I'll give it credit there. This has the more straight style mag catch. Yeah. And another change at Mishaco, pretty early on, around 1971, was moving the sling swivel from the base bottom part of the stock to the lower part of the side here. One would imagine moving it to the side just made it easier to sling across the back, having the swivel on both sides, but the bottom here, I could see, binding up a little bit. The rear sight would lose its lightning cut, actually quite early on. And of course, the barrel hardware would change. The cast gas block is pretty easy to tell. It's not a true 90 degree like we'd see on an AK-74, but it's kind of an in-between. And the front sight base would also go to a casting. Those are pretty easy to tell because typically there's a pretty distinct line in them. The rear trunnion would also go to a casting. And the rear sight base here. Easy to tell this one because of the just the soft dimple hole there. And the lever is different as well. But the front trunnion was always a forged part, a machined part. Interestingly, while the bolt carrier could also go to a cast part, the bolt itself would stay forged. So yeah. And there were changes to the automatic trigger group as well, but we can't really show those. Like I said, the sling swivel moved here, and the palm swells became more sharp and squared off at Mishaco. And these changes would all kind of come in 71, 72, that time frame. Then 73, 74, we would get another kind of round of changes. And these would be shared with the AK-74. For one, this lip was added to the takedown button. Keep it from pressing in too far. They would also go to this flared top cover, and that would also make a small change in the pattern of the safety. And that's so when the safety is fully up, this covered it. It kept it from being pressed too far over. It also worked as a better dust cover because that's part of the safety on an AK. When it's active, it does act as a de facto dust cover. Actually, Mikhail Kalashnikov borrowed this rather interesting concept from the Remington Model 8. And really one of the last changes at Izhevsk, seen late 73, 74, was the switch from the O-type rear trunnion to the fork type or U-type, which was something used with the AK-74. And pistol grips would change on and off too. And of course the bayonets issued would change. Production, it just changes. I should point out that over the years, Izhevsk cranked out more and more AKMs each year, and it seems like 1974 was their highest single production year. They built over 550,000. And then after that, in 1975, that fell down closer to 500,000. And then 76 and 77 continue to fall down because by this point, they're switching over to AK-74 production. And on paper, the last final year of AKM production was 1977, but they would still assemble some guns from existing parts, and they would definitely refurbish and repair existing AKMs and especially AKMSs. These were very much preferred in Afghanistan in the 1980s. So that's Izhevsk. What about Tula? You can see how the old school top cover and safety lined up. By the way, that safety being loose just bugged me, so I just very quickly bent it, and now it is much tighter. I can't move it, but I can't easily flick it now. Also, I crimped the top cover just a bit. Again, it's not really loose. It fits tight back here, and up here it's just the sides, but I'm going to have to tinker with it a little more later on. Things like that bug me. So, Tula, well, they made fewer AKMs than Izhevsk. How much? We don't know. The common internet rumor, kind of wisdom is only about 10% the number of Izhevsk. That's not backed up by anything, but it kind of lines up with what we know. Like I said, too, they really wouldn't do many changes through 1969, 1970. And you really don't see 1971 Tulas, at least not made for the USSR. That's because Tula had another mission. Izhevsk had made the AKM, and they were there to crank them out for domestic users and to sell to foreign clients. Tula, on the other hand, they focused on some R&D, testing, trials. Keep in mind they mostly built the AKS-74U. But they were also in charge of helping set up Kalashnikov manufacturing overseas at foreign factories. So if you want to see a 1971 Tula, we pretty much have one. Oh, come on, we had to bring it out if we're talking Tulas. The Buddy. Yeah, 1971 was the year that Tula really focused on setting up manufacturing at Factory 54 in Egypt. And the rifles they built would go to Egypt for their own purposes, to be the earliest missers. Also, a lot of parts they would create that year would go towards making parts kits for Egypt to build from. So that was their focus. So when you look at a Mahdi, it's a dead ringer for a 1971 Tula. And you really do see it here. Including with the dimple. That slightly smaller scale dimple. The two spot welds over the rivets. This does have the gloopy paint over zinc phosphating. This has the non-humped mag catch. Single hook trigger. Non-lipped takedown. Rear sight without the lightning cut. machined handguard retainer. Notice the step here versus here. Notice the gas block here. Of course, this one has the bayonet wings shaved off, but yeah, it does have the lightning cut there. And lightning cut machined front sight base. And this has the pretty much just standard slant brake. Although the furniture that Egypt used was often quite unique. And flipping them over real quick, the safety, top cover. Notice how they're very similar. This does have the kind of lazy style ribbing on Tula versus this. But yeah, a Mahdi is a really good example of a mid to late production Tula. Now, there was one other thing I wanted to mention. The rear trunnion. So let's pop a top cover. When I popped open this PSA for the first time, being in 1963, I wasn't sure if this O-type rear trunnion was correct. But it looks the same as in our Mahdi here. It would still be machined. And the reason I was a little uncertain, I thought it could be the earliest style rear trunnion. Take a look. And for this, we need to bring out another one of my favorite guns, my Hungarian SA-85M AKM 63. Notice it has the kind of earlier style top cover. It's actually because Hungary was one of the first builders of the AKM outside of Russia, so when they got the data package, it was kind of early spec, including the rear trunnion. This has the I-type, or wasp-waisted rear trunnion, where you have this centerpiece and then divisions on the sides. And I thought this ought to be the rear trunnion still in use by 1963 Tula. But actually, as it turns out, they switched to this O-type in 1962 already. So I guess it's correct, or at least correct enough. And the reason Hungary kept manufacturing this is just because that's what they had, and you'll kind of see that. It's another reason why Hungarian AKs don't have lightning cut bolt carriers. That's just kind of where they started, and they never really went away. In fact, you also see the 3 spot welds over the mag well that I was talking about. Doot, doot, doot. See, this was fun about these. Looking at the early stylings of things. You can also see the somewhat larger dimple versus this again, or even compared to the Egyptian. And it even has the unlightning cut, unrelieved front sight base. The rear sides, the gas box, a little off on this. It's a flat top, although it doesn't have the lightning cut down here. And that's because I did put a bayonet lug on this, so not 100% correct there, perhaps, but shh, no one knows. So that was what was going on with the Tula guns in the early 70s. But by 1972, they would be back in business for Russia by Russians. Just in case you were wondering, here's the bolt group. Notice the bolt itself does have lightning cuts, does have the trip on it still. The Legion build does not, because it originally, again, was a semi-automatic from Molat. Gas piston with the proper wiggle in it, so that's good. Here's the inside. This is that early style selector arm. There's our feed ramp. And of our Palmetto State barrel. Seeing how stiff that was, I'm not going to mess with it. Yeah, but by 1972, they were back to running, and they adopted some early changes. Namely, they have the side-mounted sling swivel at Tula, but interestingly, they still kept on with the late-style machined barrel hardware, although some seem to indicate they might have been using the cast handguard retainer, but the gas block and front sight base were late-style machined, and of course it was a late-style slant muzzle brake by 1972 as well. So they're very much a transitional gun. Little updated in the back, traditional in the front. They were probably using up their existing parts. But in late 1973, they would kind of go the way of casting themselves. Even then, cast Tula gas blocks and front sight bases are a little different than Mishaco. And among the final changes done to AKM production at Tula 1974 were the kind of over-lipped top cover, the flared top cover, and the lipped button in the back, because they too were switching over to AK-74 production by 1974. Interestingly, Tula wood would still remain distinct from Mishaco wood, even late on. 1975, they would still have a good AKM production line running, but 76 seems to be their last serious year. They would turn out guns by 1977 at Tula 2, but by this point, not only were they fully committing to the AK-74 or the AKS-74, they also were starting to do the AKS-74U, so they were pretty much just using up their existing parts to finish out the AKMs. In my mind, and I could be wrong on this, but it seems like Tula AKM production ended slightly before Mishaco AKM production. And when I see refurbishment and, replacement parts, they tend to be either maybe old stock from Tula or newly made furniture sets, for example, from Mishaco. And of course, both made magazines as well. And that's a brief rundown of their production. It's said that over 10.25 million AKMs have been built, the largest number of select fire rifles ever in history. Take it as you will. And in Russia, definitely the bulk were built by Mishaco. But on the other hand, Tula had quite the great influence because it would go overseas and set up factories like in Egypt and many other places besides. And of course, both would serve in Afghanistan alongside the AK-74. And it is, of course, worth pointing out that early AK-74s and late AKMs do have quite a bit in common. In fact, one reason that they added the lightning cuts to the AK-74 buttstock here was for easy identification in the field as to which caliber you were grabbing. Well, that in addition to, of course, lightning the stock. So, Legion versus Palmetto State. I've kind of given you my thoughts. What are yours? And just because it was close to hand, and because for years there have been rumors that these were built with some leftover Tula parts in Bulgaria, I just brought up my Arsenal SLR 105. Again, you can really see the similarities in the buttstocks with the swivel placement, even kind of the angle of the stock here. Of course, this has a rib butt plate for your pleasure, and it has the squared off handguard, and you can see the rivet placement here versus here for the forked trunnion, and of course comparing with Tula. It's all connected. AK leads to AKM, leads to AK-74, leads to AK-74M, which is where we were at last week with the Sagas. And just to flip over to show the top covers, the safeties, lightning cuts. the cast style parts on the 74s. Yeah, it's just one of my favorite guns. What a good shooter. And speaking of, what do I think about the Palmetto State? Has it won me over? Does it deserve a sling? I'm trying here, guys. I'm trying to give PSA a fair shot. By the way, a 3-pocket mag pouch and a later kind of soft sell for. And we gotta put a proper mag in it. I'm happy to say while the metal mag was a little tight going in, I had to kind of press it a bit, this Bakelite just snapped right in. Again, wish I could show you on camera, but you know how it goes. Bakelites, they just don't disappoint. So, pros, cons, positives, negatives, final thoughts, sling or no sling. I want to like this gun. A 1963 Tula would really complement my 1973. And it's really something I thought about even back with the Legion USA guns when those were coming in. I had some earlier Tulas, and they were tempting back then, but I resisted. Now, if I could only have one, I'd still take the later one. I like the later Russian AKMs. But, you know, this is cool too. Like I said, I did work with the safety a bit. Still got a little of that going on at the top cover. But it's not loose. It's not rattly, so I could probably live with it. And the selector isn't flopping around on me as bad. I don't like them floppy, guys. And some things people were worried about when I was reading forums before getting this were about the carrier jumping off the rails, but no, and all the rivets look good. The trigger, even if I don't like the styling, looks nice and feels nice for what it is. But of course, it's easy to change this out. This is held on with this standard, probably Red Star retaining plate. So, easiest thing in the world to drop in a fine trigger group. I don't know if the pistol grip's right. You guys can let me know. Again, the numbers match. And all the features, except maybe the mag catch, seem right to me. But if you spotted anything that I'm unaware of, please do let me know. Because I'm sure there's one or two things. There's no way these are all the original parts that came with this exact trunnion in 1963. In service or once in the USA, something got swapped around somewhere. It's inevitable. So those are the positives. Matching numbers, correct parts, the wood's in nice shape. Overall, good build quality. But, you know, there always had to be some detractions. This barrel, I'm not crazy about. The weird profiling here, but mainly where they put the marking here. If they had to do the FN markings, I can think of at least two other better places to do it. And the receiver. It's still something I can't quite put my finger on besides the spot welds, or rather, very faintly there. It just doesn't feel quite right. And I know that's super subjective and being super picky, but that kind of leads me into my kind of third big detraction, the cost. These are $2,000. If this were $1,000 or even $1,500, it'd be pretty much a no-brainer based on what Russian parts kits are going for. Really would be. But at $2,000, that's a lot of coin. Especially for a PSA. At least with the Legion or even the Atlantic, you have a real custom build on a pretty much clone correct barrel and receiver. This is close, but no cigar on being really clone correct. On the other hand, with the situation with Russia, barring large caches of Russian AKM kits from elsewhere, I don't know that we'll be getting many more in. Even if we do, the ATF's been a little strange lately about trunnions coming in. So, wouldn't be the worst investment piece, even if it is really a U.S. clone gun. So, final decision, to sling or not to sling. That is the question. That is the decision. And as much as I don't want to, I'm going to have to postpone it for further review. I was hoping it would be definitive enough I wouldn't have to, but I think this is one we're going to have to take to the range and shoot. I think it's going to all come down to how it shoots. And by that, does it feel good? Is it overgassed? Is it gassed properly? I actually really believe it'll be reliable. Maybe I'm wrong. I was wrong about the Wasser 3 last year. But my bet is on it's going to be reliable. The question is, will it be overgassed? Or will that bug me? I don't know. So, I'm going to hold off making a final decision on what to do with this. Sleep on it a bit. I need to go to the range soon anyway, so I'll put it in the rotation. I'll even give it some of my precious 7.62x39 ammo, which I've been not exactly hoarding, but being mindful of when I do shoot it for obvious situations. There you go, PSA. Get your steel case up and running. I know it won't be 20 cents a round. I know. But right now, even a reliable 35 cents a round would be okay. Not great, but okay. So, chop chop. Get to it. But I will conclude with this. Overall, at least PSA has managed to put together a gun that I'm considering owning. That's an improvement, guys. That's an improvement. So we'll just have to see. With that, what are your experiences? Any of you own one of these Soviet branded ones from PSA, the Russian type, or maybe one of the Chinese? I'd love to hear your experiences with their clone rifles, since it's a relatively new market they've jumped into in the last year and a half. Let me know. It might help me make my decision. But I hope this video, A, kind of satisfied that PSA itch, and B, I mean, you guys always like it when we talk AKs around here, and this really did just come in out of the blue this morning, and I thought, what the hell? If nothing else, it'll be a good video topic. And now I guess it'll be 2 video topics. So stay tuned soon for a probably much shorter, to succinct, to the point range report. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. Like to help us out, check out Patreon. Yada, yada, yada. I'm proud of talking. This is Misha. Catch you sometime.